A diver drops into Lake Superior and finds a man who drowned decades ago, still dressed, his face intact. The lake never let him rise. It almost never does. This is the largest freshwater lake on Earth. 31,000 square miles of water sitting near 39 degrees all year. Cold enough that your first breath in it can be your last. People say the lake kills because it is cold. That is the easy answer, and it is incomplete. Crews in 1905, in 1913, and in 1975 all learned the harder one, and every one of them saw it coming. Start with the temperature, because that is where almost everyone gets this place wrong. Lake Superior sits at the top of the Great Lakes, cupped between Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and the Ontario shore, roughly 350 miles long and 160 wide. It holds about 10% of all the fresh surface water on the planet, and it goes down more than 1,300 feet at its deepest point. A body of water that big does not warm up the way a swimming pool does. The average temperature of the whole lake hovers around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And once you get below the thin skin of surface water that the summer sun can touch, it settles near 39 degrees and stays there in July as much as in January. You can stand on a beach in Marquette in August, in shorts, sweating, and the water 20 feet out is cold enough to kill a healthy adult who falls in and cannot get out fast. Here is the part people miss. When they hear cold water, they picture hypothermia. They picture slowly freezing, shivering, drifting off over an hour or two, and they think an hour is a long time, long enough for a rescue, long enough to fight. That picture is comforting, and it is not what actually happens first. When your body hits water this cold with no warning, the first thing that fires is not the slow chill. It is a violent, involuntary gasp. Your chest seizes, your heart rate spikes, and you suck in air whether you want to or not. That first gasp measured at 6 to 10 times the size of a normal breath. If your head is underwater when that reflex hits, you inhale water instead of air, and it is over in under a minute. Cold shock, the researchers call it. It does not care how strong you are or how well you swim. If the gasp does not take you, the clock is still running. Over the next 10 minutes or so, the cold does something crueler than pain. It shuts your muscles down. Your fingers stop closing. Your arms and legs stop answering. Swimmers who could cross a pool without thinking find they cannot pull themselves the last few feet to a dock or a hull. This is the stage the life-saving people call swim failure. And it arrives long before you feel truly frozen. Only after all of that, maybe an hour in, does hypothermia finally start pulling you under for good. So the honest correction to the whole idea is this. You do not usually freeze to death in Lake Superior in 5 minutes. You drown because in the first minute, your own lungs betray you. And in the first 10, your own arms quit. The cold does not kill you slowly. It removes your options fast. And then it hides the evidence. There is an old line, made famous in song, that Superior never gives up her dead. And it turns out that is not folklore. It is chemistry. In warmer water, a drowned body sinks, and then bacteria go to work, filling the gut with gas until the body bloats and floats back to the surface within a few days. That is how the drowned are usually found. In water this cold, that bacterial process barely runs. The gas never builds. The body stays down, often for good, sometimes preserved for decades, as the cold turns its own fat into a waxy layer that slows decay almost to nothing. That diver at the very beginning was not looking at a legend. He was looking at the direct physical result of 39-degree water. Keep that image, because it becomes the quiet thread running under every wreck in this story. The lake does not just kill people here. It keeps them. None of this was a mystery to the people who lived on these shores first. The Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, called it Gichigami, the Great Sea, and they were not being poetic about the size. They read this lake the way a sailor reads a barometer. They knew which winds preceded which seas. They knew that the water was a killer in a way no summer afternoon could disguise. And above all, they knew the calendar. You traveled the open lake in the settled months. You hugged the shoreline where you could. And when the late autumn weather turned, you did not go out. That last part is the piece worth sitting with. Their survival skill was not some secret technique for beating the lake. It was restraint. It was knowing when the lake could not be beaten, and simply refusing to be on it. For thousands of years, that refusal was the difference between people who came home and people who did not. Then came engines and steel, and the whole equation changed. A sailing vessel had to respect the wind because the wind was its only power. A steamer with an iron hull and a coal fire did not, or at least it seemed not to. Suddenly a captain could drive straight across the open lake in weather that would have kept a canoe or a schooner pinned to the beach. He could keep a schedule. He could ignore the shoreline, ignore the season, ignore the single oldest rule the lake had ever taught anyone. And for a while it worked, which is exactly the problem. Technology did not make the lake safer. It made it possible to forget what the lake was, right up until the moment the lake reminded you. The men who died in the decades that followed were not fools who blundered into an unknown danger. They were professionals with the best equipment of their age, doing exactly what that equipment let them do. Consider the Cypress. She was as modern as a ship could be in the autumn of 1907. A 420-foot steel freighter fresh off the ways in Lorain, Ohio, launched only that August, barely weeks old. On the 11th of October, she was on her second voyage, loaded with iron ore out of Superior, Wisconsin, bound down the lakes for Buffalo. There was a gale blowing, but a gale was nothing a new steel ship was supposed to fear, and continuing looked entirely reasonable. She was built for this. The men aboard had no cause to think a nearly brand-new hull would fail them. Off Deer Park, on the lonely Michigan shore of the Upper Peninsula, the northwest seas began working her over. She started to list to port, and the list got worse, not better. Something was letting water in where it should not have been. And on a ship that new, nobody could have said exactly what. The crew did what crews do. They tried to fight the list and hold her on course for shelter, but a ship taking water and leaning harder with every wave has already lost most of her choices. Around 7:45 that evening, she lurched hard to port and rolled over. Of the 23 men aboard, 22 died. The lone survivor was the second mate Charles Pitts, who got onto a life raft with the captain, the first mate, and a watchman. That raft drifted through the freezing dark for nearly 7 hours and came within 300 feet of land. And then the surf flipped it again and again and drowned the other 3 men one by one. Pitts alone washed up on the beach, barely alive. A 300-foot gap between a raft and the shore, and the lake closed it against him the whole way. Hold on that raft for a second, because it is the whole cruelty of the lake compressed into one image. 4 men, on a ship that was practically new, survive the capsizing itself, get onto a raft, and then spend 7 hours in the freezing dark being carried toward a shore they cannot see. They get within a football field of solid ground, close enough that on a calm day, they could have swum it in a minute. And the surf that is built by the same storm that sank them turns their raft over and over until 3 of the 4 are gone. The cold did there exactly what the cold does. It did not need the open lake. It only needed a few minutes in the water and a shore just out of reach. Pitts survived because the last flip happened to throw him where the beach could catch him, and for no better reason than that. The exact cause of what let the water into the Cypress in the first place has never been settled. She was so new that there was little to inspect and no long record to consult, and the men who could have explained the list were on the bottom. What is not in dispute is the outcome, And the outcome is the point. The Cyprus proved something ugly right at the start of the modern age. A brand new hull, the pride of the shipyard, drowned its men exactly as fast as any wooden schooner ever had. The steel had not bought them out of the trap. It had only carried them into it faster and with more confidence. And that raises the harder question. If the newest ship afloat could go over in a single evening's gale, was the lake somehow ahead of the shipbuilders the whole time? Look back 2 years to a storm that answered part of that question in front of thousands of witnesses. On the 27th of November, 1905, the steamer Mataafa left Duluth at 5 in the afternoon, loaded with iron ore, towing the barge James Nasmyth behind her. Within an hour, the wind was already climbing past 40 miles an hour, and it kept climbing into one of the worst blows the Western Lake had ever recorded. The captain made the only sensible call. He turned the Mataafa around to run back for the shelter of the Duluth harbor entrance, that narrow gap in the piers that meant safety. He almost made it. That is what made it unbearable to watch. Trying to thread the canal in mountainous seas, the Mataafa was picked up and slammed against the stone pier, and she broke apart right there in the entrance, in shallow water within easy sight of the city. The bow section grounded near the pier. The stern, with part of the crew on it, was cut off by the breaking water and began to flood. And here the lake did the thing that no engine and no steel could answer. The men on that stern were a few hundred yards from a shore lined with people. Thousands of Duluthians came down to the lakefront and stood in the storm through the night. And they built bonfires on the beach, not because fire could reach the ship, but because it was the only thing they could do. The U.S. life-saving crew was right there, and they could not launch. The surf that was destroying the ship would have destroyed any boat they put into it. So the rescuers stood on the sand and watched, held back not by distance, but by force. They got out to the wreck the next morning, when the sea finally let them. On the bow they found the captain, and the rest alive. On the flooded stern, 9 men had died in the night, some frozen, some drowned. A few hundred yards from a crowd that never stopped watching. Across the whole lake, that storm damaged or destroyed around 29 vessels and killed roughly 36 people. The Mataafa gave its name to the whole blow. What the Mataafa proved is the thing that quietly terrifies anyone who understands it. Reaching land is not the same as reaching safety. You can be close enough to see faces on the beach, close enough that would-be rescuers are standing in the open, looking straight at you, and still be completely beyond help, because the same water that is killing you is a wall the rescuers cannot cross. The lake does not need to drag you into the middle of nowhere. It can kill you in the harbor mouth. Which forces the next question, the one that ties nearly every one of these wrecks together. If crews could see these storms coming, and clearly some of them could, then why did they keep sailing straight into them? The answer is on the ore docks, and it has a date. November of 1913 brought the deadliest storm in the recorded history of the Great Lakes, a system so violent that people who lived through it called it the White Hurricane. For 3 days, from the 7th to the 10th, it hammered the lakes with hurricane-force winds and blinding snow, and it killed more than 250 people across the region and sent something like a dozen ships to the bottom. Weather warnings did exist by 1913, telegraphed to ports, and hoisted as storm flags, but they moved slowly. They underestimated a storm that would exceed anything on record, and they carried no force. A warning is only advice. It does not turn a ship around. A man does that, and a man has a boss, a contract, and a calendar. On the 9th of November, at 5 in the afternoon, with that storm already tearing across the lake, the freighter Henry B. Smith backed away from the ore dock at Marquette, Michigan, and headed straight out into it. She was a big, sound steel ship, 545 feet, loaded with iron ore. The decision to sail into a blizzard sounds insane at a century's distance. It was not insane in the moment. The shipping season on Lake Superior slams shut when winter locks the harbors, and every ton of ore not delivered before the ice is money lost and a season judged a failure. Crews sailed under exactly that pressure, the pressure to get one more cargo down the lake before the door closed for the year. So the Smith went out into weather that everyone on that dock could see with their own eyes. She did not come back. Somewhere out on the lake in seas that would have been staggering, she broke apart and went down with all 25 men aboard. Only 2 bodies were ever recovered. For 100 years, no one even knew where she lay, whether she had foundered close in or been driven far out. And that not knowing is its own kind of verdict on the lake, because a ship of 545 feet can vanish so completely that a century passes with no confirmed trace. The wreck was not found until 2013, a century almost to the day after she sank. And when searchers finally located her, she was sitting on the bottom, broken in 2 near the middle, her oar spilled across the lake bed around her. The physical proof of a ship that had simply been torn apart. The mechanism that matters here is not exotic. She left a dock in a rising blizzard, in the last frantic weeks of a season that was about to close, and a hull driven at speed into short, steep, repeating seas takes a beating amidships that no plate can absorb forever. Whether she opened up, rolled, or was overwhelmed on deck, the trigger was the same one that pulled her off that dock in the first place. The Henry B. Smith is the answer to the question the Mataafa raised. Crews sailed into storms they could see because the thing pushing them out was not ignorance of the weather. It was economics, and orders, and the calendar, and the plain fact that a captain who waited for perfect conditions every time would not keep his job. Seeing the storm was never the missing piece. The missing piece was the power to say no, and that power did not belong to the men on the water, which sets up the obvious hope. Warnings in 1913 were slow and weak, so build better ones. Give a captain radio, give him radar, give him a forecast good enough and early enough, give him a ship far bigger and stronger than anything the old sailors could have dreamed of, and surely, finally, the trap closes. That was the promise of the modern age on the lake. On the 10th of November 1975, that promise met Lake Superior, and the lake was entirely unimpressed. The Edmund Fitzgerald carried a reputation the earlier wrecks never had. When she was launched in 1958, she was the largest ship on the Great Lakes. 729 feet of steel, a record setter. A boat crews were proud to sail. She had radar. She had radio. She had a forecast. Her captain, Ernest McSorley, was a veteran of decades on these waters, not a man to be surprised by November. On the 9th, she loaded a full cargo of taconite iron ore pellets at Superior, Wisconsin, and set out down the lake bound for the Detroit area, in company for much of the way with another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson. A storm was forecast, and both captains knew it. And both, reading the forecast, chose a more northerly track along the Canadian shore that looked like the safer route. This was not recklessness. This was 2 experienced men using the best information of their era to make a defensible plan. The storm that came was worse than the plan allowed for. It deepened explosively over the lake, the way November storms on Superior do. When the water is still holding the last of its summer warmth, and Arctic air comes pouring down from the northwest. That temperature contrast is fuel. It drives the low pressure down and the winds up. And on a lake with hundreds of miles of open water for the wind to work across, the seas build with nothing to stop them. By that afternoon, the Fitzgerald was in winds gusting to hurricane force near 90 miles an hour, in seas running up around 35 feet. And the waves were not just tall. On a lake, storm waves come short and steep and close together, one slamming the hull before the ship has finished recovering from the last, so a big laker does not ride them so much as get hammered by them in sequence. This is where the geometry of a lake turns against a ship. Ocean swells are long and spaced out, and a well-designed hull can rise and fall through them. Superior's storm seas are compressed. Wall after wall arriving before the bow has lifted clear of the one before, and a long ore carrier can end up bridged between two crests with her heavy midsection unsupported over the trough, or buried at the bow while the stern is still climbing. It is a punishing, hammering motion, and it is exactly the motion that finds every weak vent, hatch, and seam a ship has. There is a second, colder trap folded inside the same storm, and it stalks smaller vessels in particular. When the air drops below freezing and the wind is throwing spray over a ship, that spray freezes where it lands. Ice builds on rails, rigging, decks, and superstructure, and every ton of it sits high, above the waterline, above the point the ship balances on. A vessel is stable because its weight sits low. Load it with ice up top and you raise that balance point until the ship becomes tender, rolls further with each sea, and is slower to come back until one roll simply does not come back at all. Crews in these conditions have to go out onto pitching, frozen decks in the dark, and beat the ice off with mallets and bars, fighting to shed weight faster than the lake can pile it on. It is brutal, dangerous work, and it is the physical reason a freezing gale is deadlier than a warm one of the same wind speed. Then, out on that lake, McSorley's problems began to stack, and you can follow them almost in real time because he kept reporting them to the ship behind him. In the middle of the afternoon, he came on the radio to the Anderson's Captain Cooper with a short, ugly inventory. He had a fence rail down. He had lost or damaged 2 vents. And he had a list. On a loaded ore carrier, a list that appears out of nothing and does not correct itself means water is getting in somewhere and gathering low in the hull. And McSorley said he had his pumps running to fight it. A vent gone and a fence rail down are the small structural wounds that let a boarding sea find its way below. He was not panicking. He was managing. He even asked Cooper to keep the Anderson close behind and follow him in toward the shelter of Whitefish Bay. One professional asking another to stay near in case things got worse. They got worse in the specific way that removes options. About half an hour later, McSorley radioed again, and now both of the Fitzgerald's radars had quit. Sit with what that means on a night like that one. His eyes in the storm were gone. In blinding snow and spray, with a list and water in the hull, he could no longer see the shore he was running for, and he was reduced to asking the Anderson to track him on her radar and pass him steering directions, one ship guiding another through the dark by voice. And then the last props were kicked away, because the storm had also knocked out the light and the radio beacon at Whitefish Point, the very navigation marks he was steering toward. The Coast Guard confirmed to him that the beacon and the light were down. So here was the state of the most advanced ship on the lake in her final hour. She was heavy with water, leaning, running for a harbor she could not see, with her own radar dead, guided secondhand by a ship miles astern, aiming at a light that was no longer lit. Every instrument the modern age had given him to beat this exact situation had gone out one by one, and the safe water was still miles ahead. Every choice he had was narrowing at the same time. His last message is one of the most quietly chilling things ever said on the lake, and it was not a cry for help. Asked how he was making out, McSorley answered, "We are holding our own." That was around 7:10 in the evening. Minutes later, the Fitzgerald simply vanished from the Anderson's radar screen. No mayday, no distress call, no flare, no lifeboat signal, nothing. A 729-foot ship with 29 men aboard was there, and then it was not, and the men behind her did not even realize at first that she was gone rather than lost in the clutter of the storm. And here the modern rescue system, the whole apparatus that was supposed to have solved this, ran into the same wall the lifesavers hit at Duluth in 1905. Trace how a rescue on Lake Superior actually unfolds, step by step, and you see why the technology never mattered as much as anyone hoped. First, something has to recognize that a ship is gone, and even that was not instant. When the Fitzgerald dropped off the radar, Cooper could not be sure at first whether she had sunk or simply been swallowed in the storm clutter on his screen, and it took time and repeated failed radio calls before the horror became certain. Then the Coast Guard had to be alerted and had to authorize and organize a response. Then whatever could actually go had to be found, and the assets close enough to help were painfully thin. The Anderson herself, having barely lived through the same storm, turned around and drove back into it to search, which was an act of plain courage by Cooper and his crew, and one other freighter already sheltering in Whitefish Bay, the William Clay Ford, put back out into the seas to help. That was nearly the entire immediate response. 2 merchant ships. The Coast Guard's own assets tell the whole story of distance. Around 10 that night, the service launched a fixed-wing aircraft and ordered out 2 cutters. One of them, the Naugatuck, did not reach the search area until the following afternoon. The other, the Woodrush, was moored at Duluth, at the far western end of the lake. And although her crew had her underway at full speed into the same gale within a couple of hours of the call, she was so far away that she needed roughly a day of hard steaming just to arrive, and days to complete her part of the search. The nearest heavy Coast Guard vessel was a full lake away, and the fastest she could physically move through that sea still left the wreck site alone for many hours. Satellite-age communication had told everyone within minutes that the Fitzgerald was gone. It could not move a single ship 1 mile closer to her. The distance was exactly what it had always been, and the sea in between was exactly as hostile. So the search, when it finally combed the water, was not looking for survivors. It was looking for evidence. What it found was debris and an oil slick, and eventually 2 lifeboats, both battered, both empty. Not one of the 29 men was ever recovered. The lake kept every one of them, exactly as the chemistry says it would. And the open question from the very beginning of this story, why Superior does not give back its dead, closed for good over that wreck. 39-degree water does not float the drowned, and it does not negotiate. So the modern lesson is the hardest one in the whole story. Radar, radio, and forecasting are not useless. They are the reason many ships now survive nights that would have killed them a century ago. But look closely at what they actually do. A forecast can warn a captain a storm is coming. It cannot make the shelter any closer, and it cannot buy him back the hours he needs to run for it once the storm arrives early or grows past prediction. Radar can show a ship the hazards around it, right up until the storm knocks the radar out. Radio can carry a message instantly to anyone on the lake, and the Fitzgerald's crew never even had time to send one. Better communication does not shorten the distance a rescuer has to cover, and it does not calm the sea the rescuer has to cross. The technology closed the gap between the ship and the shore's knowledge of it. It never closed the gap between the ship and the shore. What actually sank the Edmund Fitzgerald is a fight that has never ended, and honesty requires admitting that. The U.S. Coast Guard Board of Inquiry concluded that the most probable cause was massive flooding of the cargo hold through hatch covers that were not sealed tightly enough, letting the seas pour in until the ship lost buoyancy. The Lake Carriers Association, representing the shipping companies, rejected that flatly, arguing those hatch covers had been used reliably for decades, and proposed instead that the Fitzgerald had scraped over a shallow area near Caribou Island, the 6-fathom shoal, tearing her hull open. That theory has its own problem, because a later, more precise survey of her route suggested the shoal as charted was partly an error and did not sit where the theory needed it. Others argue she was simply overwhelmed by a series of enormous waves, the so-called Three Sisters, boarding her deck faster than she could shed them, or that the hull failed structurally under the strain. 50 years on, There is no agreed answer. The men who could have told us said only that they were holding their own, and then the lake kept its silence along with its dead. Step back from the individual wrecks, and the shape of the whole trap comes into focus. And it is not one danger. It is a system, and every part of it depends on the others. The geography sets the terms first. A lake this large gives storm winds hundreds of miles of open water to build waves across. And those waves turn short and steep and vicious as they crowd into shallower water near the shore and the shoals. The weather then activates the geography because in November the lake still holds summer's warmth while the first Arctic air arrives. And that clash breeds storms that deepen with terrifying speed. The water itself supplies the force and the finality. 39 degrees that stops a swimmer's body in minutes and then refuses to return what it takes. Human motive supplies the exposure, the iron ore and the contracts, and the closing season that push crews out past the point of caution. Technology changes what those crews will attempt, letting steel and engines and radar carry them into water the old people knew to stay off of. And distance and weather together decide how fast every option disappears. Whether the rescuers are held on a Duluth beach in 1905 or turned back into the storm in 1975. That is why the same disaster keeps recurring across eras that look nothing alike on paper. A wooden life-saving crew and a Coast Guard aircraft are separated by 70 years of progress, and both were stopped by the same wall of moving water. A brand new steel ship in 1907 and a record-breaking flagship in 1975 both went down in a single night with almost everyone aboard. The tools kept improving. The trap did not change because the trap was never really about the tools. Notice the calendar tying every one of these wrecks together. The Mataafa in late November, the Cypress in October, the Henry B. Smith and the White Hurricane in early November, the Fitzgerald on the 10th of November. That is not coincidence, and it is not superstition, even though sailors gave it a name, the Gales of November. It is physics on a schedule. By late autumn, the huge mass of the lake is still holding the heat it soaked up all summer, while the air above the continent has already turned to winter and Arctic cold is spilling south. Warm water under cold air is the exact recipe for a storm to feed on, and a low-pressure system crossing the region at that moment can deepen with a speed that outruns the plans of anyone caught under it. It is the same few weeks, year after year, when the lake is most primed to turn violent and the shipping season is most desperate to squeeze out its final cargoes. The danger peaks at the precise moment the pressure to sail peaks. That overlap is the trap's black heart. If anything, the modern era has quietly widened the exposure rather than closing it. The shipping season now stretches deeper into the dangerous months than the old sailors would have dared. Pushed by the same economic pressure that sent the Henry B. Smith off the dock in 1913, because confidence in modern ships and forecasts makes it feel acceptable to run later into the teeth of the year. More capability has a way of expanding the boundary of what people are willing to risk, right up to the edge of what the lake will still punish, and the lake's edge has not moved. So picture the thing that is happening on Lake Superior right now, tonight, on some November evening, not different in any important way from the ones in this story. A 1,000-foot laker eases away from an oar dock and points her bow out into open water, radar sweeping, forecast printed out. A good and careful captain on the bridge who knows exactly what month it is. Spray comes over the rail and starts to freeze there in a thin gray crust. Beneath the hull, 400 feet down, the water sits at 39 degrees, the same temperature it held over the Cypress, and the Mataafa, and the Henry B. Smith, and the Fitzgerald. Indifferent to every one of them. Everything that killed those crews is still in place. Every piece of it. Waiting in the same arrangement. The cargo still has to move. The season still closes. The lake still keeps what it takes. And another ship goes out anyway.